as possible. I was fortunate enough to travel to Bali and interview the presidents of Chile and Mexico both in the same week. I think the sign of a truly global channel is that we can attract these type of guests from all over the world. I'm Elaine Reyes, and I'm an anchor at CCTV America.
We are CCTV America.
Welcome back to Biz Asia America. I am Philip Yen in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Michelle McCory in New York. Let's take a look at some of our other top headlines from around the business world. The U.S. trade deficit narrowed by 5.6% in May. Now, that's more than economists had expected and the biggest drop since last November. Record exports were the reason for the smaller gap. Fiat Chrysler is planning to list on the New York Stock Exchange later this year. That's if shareholders approve the proposed merger of the two automakers. And lawmakers in Germany have approved the country's first ever minimum wage. Starting next year, workers will be guaranteed at least $11.60 per hour. Phil, back to you in D.C.
All right, Michelle, stay dry over there. Thank you. The European Central Bank has hinted it may try printing more money if it attempts to reverse deflation. If that fails, the ECB did not adjust its rates, which are already near zero at its monthly meeting. Last month, it sent rates negative. That's helping to push banks to lend money instead of sitting on cash. President Mario Draghi said the ECB was ready to move to use more unconventional measures if inflation did not go back up to its target rate of 2%. Now, inflation there is currently a little more than just 0.1%, essentially flat. And analysts say that the options include pumping more money into the Eurozone economies if deflation continues. Now, the ECB's move last month to reduce one of the deposit rates into negative territory was unprecedented. The idea was to discourage banks from simply parking their money at the central bank and slightly improve the interbank lending. But it's a different story for consumer credit. Jack Barton reports from Brussels.
Belgian car dealer Serge Dijk says car prices at his dealership have plummeted by as much as 35% since the start of the economic crisis.
The banks are very strict and very difficult to have to give some money now.
Dijk says the situation hasn't changed since the European Central Bank started charging banks a deposit fee last month, in the hope of getting them to seek better returns by lending to each other as well as to households, businesses and governments. There have been signs of change, such as lower yields on treasury bills in countries like Spain, Italy and Portugal. But the big banks in the Eurozone's core remain risk-averse when it comes to parking money in the bloc's still economically troubled periphery. Many analysts say it's still too early to gauge the policy's impact.
It will take some time before the full effects will be implemented through the banking system.
Some believe the ECB's real aim is to push down the value of the euro by encouraging foreign investors to seek higher returns elsewhere. A strategy adopted recently by Denmark as well as Japan during its so-called lost decade.
Europe is now, if not already, but on a good way of becoming where Japan was in the post-bubble years. Basically, we are looking at a period of very, very low growth, if any.
While the move is widely seen as a positive step, for real growth to return to the single currency area, many would like to see Europe's central bank take a much more aggressive stance when it comes to stimulating the bloc's tepid recovery. Jack Barton, CCTV, Brussels.
Now, one central bank that did deeply cut its rate Thursday was Sweden's Riksbank. It reduced its main lending rate by half a point to just 0.25%. And like the ECB, it took its deposit rate to minus 0.5%. Now, Sweden does not use the euro, but it does have the same concerns about deflation. Now, earlier I spoke to Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I asked him why businesses aren't taking full advantage of these record low interest rates.
Well, I think to some extent in some countries they have. But I think the problem is that in the crisis countries in Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, to some extent Italy, the real problem is that the non-financial sector businesses are still over-leveraged. They, basically they still have too much debt from pre-crisis. Because one of the differences between these economies and the United States is that restructuring of debt, write-downs of debt, is much more, has been much slower. And therefore, if you're already overextended in terms of borrowing, even if the rate is zero, you're not going to take on any more debt. And that's the problem. There's no demand for new loans, basically.
We both recently came back from Europe, and one of the things that I took away from some of my visits to cities there was that I did not see a lot of cranes. I did not see a lot of construction projects. I did not see a lot of sort of future planning that you would see here even in Washington, D.C. or in Beijing or other parts of the world where things are starting to pick up again. Is it necessary for us to see those construction cranes before we can say that Europe has turned the corner?
It would certainly be helpful, but I think, again, we need to be realistic. In a place like Spain, where basically the entire country suffered from a massive construction bubble, I'm not sure that new cranes are really going to be the sign of recovery. Rather, it will be that some of all the office towers that were built before the crisis that had been empty until now began to be filled up.
Throwing money at the banks in hopes that the banks loan the money out to the general public doesn't seem to have had the impact that a lot of economists had hoped for. What else can perhaps domestic governments do to encourage the creation of jobs? Because there was talk of reforms, and I know some countries took that and ran with it, and some didn't.
Well, I mean, there's essentially two things you can do. One is the one that they've been talking about, which is structural reforms. We're going to liberalize our labor markets, make it easier to hire and fire workers, etc. But the problem with those kinds of reforms is that they actually take a long time for it to work. So even if you did it a couple of years ago, it may actually still be 1, 2, 3 years before it starts to work.
You have the ECB that essentially has cut rates. You have the Bank of England that is looking to perhaps raise rates. You have Janet Yellen and her crew here in Washington, D.C. looking at when they might actually begin to talk about raising rates. Is it important that all the central banks are on the same page, or is it really okay that some are cutting and some are raising?
No, absolutely. That's what you want. You absolutely want each central bank to follow the business cycle in their individual country. You don't want the ECB to be raising rates just because the Fed is raising rates. That would be insane. In fact, I think the ECB is secretly hoping that the Federal Reserve will raise rates sooner rather than later, because what will happen is that you'll have a divergence between interest rates in the US and the euro area, and that may cause the euro to decline a little bit.
Is it possible that America could help Europe recover?
I think it is generally the case that the American business cycle is far more progressed than the European one. So in that sense, the United States will be helping to pull Europe out of its recession. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget, the first quarter growth in the United States was almost -3%. The U.S. recovery is still a very bumpy one.
Do you think Janet Yellen has done the right thing to hold off on even any discussion of raising rates? I mean, she's been very, very quiet about that.
Yeah, I think she's making the right call, because I think that when I look at an unemployment rate of 6.1%, I think it is excessively good. If you look at the actual health of the U.S. labor market, it is worse than what 6.1% reflects. So people who are saying that, there's all this wage pressures, et cetera, because of an unemployment rate of that level, I think they're exaggerating it. I don't see any wage pressures really in the U.S. labor market. And until we see that, I don't think the Fed should be raising rates.
When you compare the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, who's doing the best job?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that the Federal Reserve had the best tools available when the crisis began, and therefore they were able to deploy, QE, aggressive loosening, take a lot of measures in a preemptive manner. The ECB was hamstrung by the fact that they didn't have the sort of same institutional partners that the Federal Reserve has here in Washington. So I think actually that all of them have done a pretty good job. I mean, there's no doubt.
Would you give them an A? All of them an A?
I would give them somewhere between, you know, a B+ and an A-, all of them, factoring in the different circumstances, because there's no doubt that it is the central banks, much more than the politicians, that quote unquote bailed us all out after 2008.
That was Jacob Kirkegaard, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you. Coming up next on this show, we will take a look at food security. And while there have been concerns about supply due to the growing global population, one study says there is nothing to worry about. We are back in just a minute.
With the eyes of the world focused on the World Cup in Brazil, Americas Now will take a closer look at the social and economic issues facing this large and diverse country. Join us for the weeks leading up to and during the World Cup as we take you to the heart of Brazil, only on CCTV America.